James, a man of unassuming stature, often found refuge in the dusty corridors of the university library. His wire-framed glasses perched precariously on his nose as he pored over ancient texts, his eyes reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights above. Despite the modern era's allure, his heart remained tethered to the past, a scholarly relic amidst the digital revolution. He was a professor, yes, but one that walked the fine line between academic respect and social obscurity. His tweed jacket, worn thin at the elbows, whispered of his dedication to knowledge and his humble beginnings. "Hey, James," called a familiar voice, pulling him from his historical reverie. It was Laura, the head librarian, her hair a fiery halo of unbridled energy around her face. "Another late night for you?" He glanced up, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Just a page or two more, Laura," he replied, his voice a gentle rasp that mirrored the pages he touched. "My father's condition has me seeking answers." Her expression softened, understanding in her eyes. "How's he holding up?" "As well as can be expected," James said with a sigh, pushing his glasses further up his nose. "The bills are piling up, though. The treatments are expensive." The silence that followed was filled with the soft rustle of pages turning and the distant murmur of students. Laura placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're doing all you can, James. We're all rooting for him." Summary 1. James, a devoted history professor, is frequently found in the library's ancient texts section. His focus on the past contrasts with the modern world. Laura, the empathetic head librarian, notices his late-night studies and inquires about his father's health, revealing the financial strain James faces due to the expensive treatments. The weight of her words seemed to anchor him, if only briefly. He nodded, a silent promise to himself to find a way to ease his father's burdens. As the clock chimed midnight, James gathered his books and left the sanctuary of the library, the cold reality of his situation seeping into his bones like the winter chill outside. The hallowed halls of academia had become both his solace and his battleground. The next day, James walked into his classroom, feeling the familiar heaviness in his heart. The room was already half filled with sleepy-eyed students, their faces buried in their laptops and notebooks. Then he saw her, a vision in stark contrast to the monochrome of his life. Ivy, a student in his history class, sat in the back row, her emerald eyes flickering up to meet his gaze. Her beauty was undeniable, a stark reminder of the world outside his dusty tomes. "Good morning, Professor," she said sweetly, as he approached the podium. The sound of her voice sent an unexpected jolt through him, one that made him feel both alive and uneasy. "Good morning, Ivy," he replied, trying to keep his tone even. "I hope you're ready for today's lecture on the Roman Empire." He couldn't help but notice the way she leaned in slightly as he began to speak, her full lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was engaged, yes, but it was a focus that was almost predatory. Her dark thoughts remained a mystery to him, hidden beneath the veneer of her charm. Summary 1. The next day, James, feeling the burden of his father's health and financial situation, enters his history class where he's struck by Ivy's beauty. Despite her seemingly sweet demeanor, he senses a mysterious intensity in her gaze that makes him feel both alive and unsettled. As the days turned to weeks, James found it increasingly difficult to ignore the way Ivy's gaze lingered on him, the subtle shifts in her demeanor that seemed to speak of something more sinister. It was as if she knew his secrets, could feel the turmoil he carried with him like an invisible cloak. Yet, he remained oblivious to the truth lurking just beneath the surface. One evening, as the last of the students filed out, Ivy approached James's desk, a knowing glint in her eye. "Your dedication to your work is inspiring, Professor," she said, her voice like a silk scarf wrapping around his consciousness. James looked up, surprised by the intimacy in her tone. "Thank you, Ivy," he said, unsure of what to make of her sudden interest. "I just want to make sure my students understand the importance of history." "And what of your personal history, Professor?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your father's health, it must weigh heavily on you." He nodded, feeling the weight of his worries settle back onto his shoulders. "It does," he admitted, "but I'm managing." "Perhaps I can help," she offered, her smile widening to reveal a hint of something sharp. "My family has some connections." We might be able to assist with the financial burden. Summary. 1. Over time, James becomes aware of Ivy's intense gaze and the underlying tension it carries. One evening, she approaches him with a seemingly innocent question about his personal life, specifically his father's health, and then surprisingly offers help with the financial strain, hinting at her family's influential connections. The proposition took James aback. He'd heard rumors about Ivy's family, their immense wealth and power that stretched beyond the confines of the university. The offer was tempting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was a hidden cost to her kindness. "That's very generous of you," he said cautiously. "It's the least I can do," she replied, her eyes gleaming. "After all, knowledge is a powerful tool. And I'm quite certain you have something valuable to offer in return." The tension in the room grew thick, the air crackling with unspoken intentions. James felt a shiver of foreboding, unsure of what exactly Ivy was insinuating. Yet, the desperation to save his father's life whispered seductively in his ear, urging him to consider the offer. As they left the classroom, the shadows grew longer, and the silence between them grew heavier. James knew that the decision he was about to make could change the course of his life forever, but he also knew that the price of ignoring her might be far steeper than he could bear. "What do you want from me, Ivy?" he asked, his voice tight with apprehension. "Simply your presence, Professor," she replied, her smile never wavering. "My family has the means to ensure that your father receives the best care available. In return, you will visit my home each evening and do as I say." He swallowed hard. "What kind of things are we talking about?" Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Oh, nothing too demanding. Just a few tasks to keep you on your toes. Think of it as an opportunity to learn something new outside of your dusty books." James felt a knot form in his stomach, but he nodded, his mind racing with the implications of his decision. "All right," he murmured. "I'll do it." The following evening, James found himself standing in front of a grand, Gothic mansion at the edge of town. The ivy-covered facade seemed to watch him with a knowing gaze as he climbed the steps to Ivy's front door. It swung open before he could knock, revealing the warm glow of the interior and the faint sound of classical music. "Welcome," she purred, dressed in a flowing gown that left little to the imagination. "I trust you're ready to begin?" He stepped inside, the door closing with a finality that echoed through the grand hallway. The opulence was suffocating, a stark contrast to his modest apartment and the stark reality of his father's condition. "I'm here," he said, his voice firm despite his trepidation. Ivy's tasks began innocently enough, organizing her vast collection of rare artifacts, helping her with her studies, even engaging in intellectual debates that often lasted well into the night. Yet, with each passing day, the assignments grew more peculiar, hinting at a darker purpose behind her intentions. "Tonight," she began one evening, her eyes gleaming, "I want you to find something for me. A very special book. It's hidden in the library's restricted archives." James frowned. "That's against university policy." "Is it?" she challenged, her smile never fading. "But for your father's sake," he knew she had him cornered. With a sigh, he nodded. "I'll find it." The archives were a labyrinth of dusty shelves and forgotten knowledge, the air thick with the scent of aged paper. His heart raced as he searched, aware of the cameras and the security guards that patrolled the halls. But the promise of his father's health fueled his determination. When he finally found the book she'd described, an ancient tome bound in leather and adorned with arcane symbols, he felt a thrill of excitement and dread. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, one where the rules were being rewritten with every passing day. But as he handed the book to Ivy, her smile grew cold, and he realized that he had just become a pawn in a game much larger than he could ever have imagined. Her eyes searched his, looking for signs of regret or fear, but all James felt was a burning need to know what was happening, to understand the true nature of the bargain he'd struck. "You've done well," she praised, her voice like a velvet whisper. "But remember, Professor, the debt is only growing. And one day, it will come due." The implications of her words sent a chill down his spine, and he knew that the price of his father's health would be paid in ways he could never have foreseen. Yet, he had no choice but to continue playing along, hoping that somehow, he could find a way out of the tangled web she'd spun around him. Days turned into weeks, and the once simple tasks grew increasingly complex. Ivy began dictating his every move, from the shirts he wore to the books he read. She even had a say in the meals he ate, insisting on preparing them herself to ensure they adhered to her peculiar specifications. The taste of her culinary creations grew bitter in his mouth, each bite a silent acknowledgement of his subservience. "James," she'd say, her voice a soft caress, "you're looking tired. Let me pick out your outfit today." And so, he'd stand in his own bedroom, allowing her to drape him in clothes that she deemed suitable for the man she'd shaped him to be. He felt like a marionette, his strings pulled by her unseen hand. "You can't go out tonight," she'd announce, her eyes gleaming with a power that seemed almost supernatural. "You need to rest. I've arranged for everything you need to be brought here." And just like that, his plans with colleagues or a quiet evening at the pub were replaced with more of her tasks, her endless hunger for knowledge and control swallowing his free will. The library had become a prison of his own making, his sanctuary now a place of dread as he searched for the obscure tomes she demanded. The other professors began to notice his change in behavior, the way he'd flinch if anyone mentioned Ivy's name, the dark circles that had taken up residence under his eyes. They whispered behind his back, their concern growing into suspicion. One evening, as James stumbled home, drained from another night in the archives, he caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him, his eyes hollow and his smile forced. "Ivy," he said, his voice shaking, "this has to stop." Her laugh was cold, echoing through the opulent hallways of her mansion. "Stop?" she repeated, her eyes flashing. "But we've only just begun, Professor. You're mine now." That night, as Ivy reclined in a chair, her bare feet in his lap, James felt the last vestiges of his will crumbling. Her skin was smooth, her toes perfectly manicured, the scent of jasmine and sandalwood wafting from her pores. The room was dimly lit, casting an eerie glow on the scene unfolding before him. "Your feet are like works of art," he murmured, his voice hoarse with disbelief and desire. "Kiss them," she demanded, her voice a purr. "Show me your devotion." James leaned in, his eyes transfixed by the sight before him. He pressed his lips to her foot, feeling the softness of her skin, the warmth of her body beneath him. The act was strange, yet oddly compelling. Ivy's toes curled slightly, a silent testament to her enjoyment, and he felt a thrill run through him. "More," she urged, her eyes never leaving his. James kissed her arch, her heel, her toes. Each press of his lips sent a wave of something primal through him, a mix of fear and excitement that he couldn't quite name. She was his student, yet she wielded power over him like a queen over a servant. "Good," she said, her voice a whisper. "You're learning." As he continued, he felt the weight of his situation pressing down upon him, the reality of his ensnarement in her twisted games becoming all too clear. Yet, with each kiss, he found himself falling deeper, the promise of his father's health a siren's call that drowned out the alarms in his mind. When he was done, she pulled her foot away, leaving his mouth feeling empty. "Now," she said, her eyes gleaming with victory, "we shall see what else you're capable of." James felt a strange mix of horror and arousal at her words. He had never been one for such degradation, but here he was, eager to please his new goddess. "Tell me what you wish, Ivy," he murmured, his voice thick with obedience. "You shall address me as goddess from now on," she said, her tone firm. "And you shall do as I command, without question." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes, goddess." Her smile grew wider. "Good boy," she cooed. "Now, remove your glasses and bring them to me." James did as he was told, feeling a strange thrill as he handed her the symbol of his intellectual identity. She took them and placed them on the table with a gentle clink. "You won't need these anymore," she said. "You're beyond mere academics now." The next evening, James found himself kneeling before her, his glasses discarded. Ivy had set up a ritualistic space, candles casting flickering shadows on the walls, the air heavy with incense. She held a small bowl filled with a murky liquid. "Drink," she ordered. He took the bowl with trembling hands, bringing it to his lips. The taste was bitter, but he downed it eagerly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good," she said, her voice soothing. "Now, you truly belong to me." James felt the room spin, his senses heightened. He could hear the blood pumping in his ears, the crackling of the candle flames, the rustle of her gown as she moved. He was hers, completely and utterly. As the days went on, James found himself slipping further and further into her world of dark desires and ancient rituals. His life became a blur of tasks and rituals, each more degrading than the last. Yet, he couldn't find the will to resist. The love potion she had given him had not just ensnared his heart, it had bound his soul. "Goddess," he whispered one evening as she traced patterns on his bare back, "what is it you seek from me?" "Oh, James," she said, her voice filled with amusement, "you're so naive. I seek power. Power over you, power over knowledge, power over life itself." Her words sent a shiver down his spine, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his body craving more. He was her devoted servant now, her pet to do with as she wished. And deep down, he knew that he loved it, that he had become something he never thought he could be. The whispers around the university grew louder, but James paid them no mind. He was too lost in Ivy's world to care about his dwindling reputation. His colleagues' looks of pity and concern were nothing compared to the ecstasy he found in her embrace. One night, as they lay tangled together in her bed, James made a decision. He would use his newfound love for Ivy to his advantage. He would find a way to make her love him, to care for him as he did for her. And in doing so, perhaps he could change their dynamic, become an equal in this twisted dance of power and passion. He rolled over to face her, his eyes filled with determination. "Goddess," he said, his voice earnest, "I want to know you, truly know you. Can we share something real?" Ivy looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might reject him, might cast him aside like one of her forgotten artifacts. But then she leaned in, her breath warm on his face. "Very well," she murmured. "We'll play your game, James. But remember, the rules are still mine to make." And with that, she kissed him, her lips as soft as velvet. James closed his eyes, hoping against hope that he wasn't just setting himself up for a fall. Months passed by, and the whispers grew to murmurs that echoed through the grand halls of the university. It was no longer a secret that James, the once respected historian, had become Ivy's devoted servant. The students and faculty alike had witnessed his transformation, the way he'd come to wear her commands like a second skin. Yet, instead of the disgust or pity one might expect, there was a strange sort of fascination in their gazes. "Look at them," Laura, the head librarian, said one day, her voice filled with sadness. "It's like he's under a spell." "Perhaps," James replied, his eyes never leaving Ivy's retreating form as she glided away from the library, her hips swaying with an allure that was almost mesmerizing. "But it's a spell I chose to cast upon myself." Their relationship grew stronger in its own twisted way, a dance of power and submission that neither of them could resist. Yet, amidst the rituals and the humiliation, James felt a strange warmth blossom in his chest. He had never imagined himself capable of loving someone as fiercely as he loved Ivy, nor had he ever felt loved in return. Her coldness was a mask, and he knew it, but beneath it was a woman who craved connection as much as he did. One evening, as they lay together in the dim glow of her chambers, Ivy looked at him with something akin to affection. "You've been a good pet," she said, her voice almost gentle. "But it's time to up the stakes." "Anything, goddess," James murmured, his heart racing. Her smile grew wicked. "Tonight, you will truly understand what it means to serve me." The night unfolded with a series of rituals that pushed James to the brink of his endurance. He was slapped and trampled, made to endure pain that made his eyes water and his body ache. Yet, with each indignity, he felt a strange thrill, a sense of belonging that surpassed his wildest dreams. "You love this, don't you?" Ivy taunted, her bare foot pressing down on his chest. James looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and adoration. More than anything, he confessed, their dynamic never changed, even as their love grew stronger. Ivy reveled in her control, pushing James to the edge of what he could handle and then pulling him back, ensuring he remained firmly in her grasp. Yet, in those moments of absolute power, she began to show signs of vulnerability, her eyes softening when she looked at him. "Ivy," James whispered one night, as she straddled his face, her heel pressing into his cheek, "why do you need to control me?" "Because," she said, her voice filled with a quiet desperation, "without this power, without you beneath me, I'd be nothing. I'd just be another pretty face in a sea of mediocrity." He licked her toes, savoring the taste of her, the feeling of her dominance. "You're so much more than that," he said. "Prove it," she challenged, her eyes gleaming with unshed tears. "Show me that I'm wrong." And so he did, every day, with his unwavering devotion and his willingness to submit. He showed her that she could be loved, that she didn't need to control him to feel whole. Yet, the games continued, a silent acknowledgement of their shared need for the thrill of power and submission. As the seasons changed outside, so too did their love within the confines of Ivy's mansion. It grew more complex, more tangled, a web spun from the threads of their darkest desires. But in the heart of it all, there was a spark of something pure, something that burned brighter than the candles that illuminated their twisted rituals. It was a love that defied the norms of society, a love born from the ashes of their shared pain and the need for something more. And as they lay entwined in the throes of passion, James knew that he would never find the strength to break free, nor did he want to. For in her control, he had found a freedom that no academic achievement could ever match. One evening, Ivy presented him with a collar, made of the finest leather and adorned with gleaming metal. "You will wear this at all times," she ordered, her voice a seductive whisper. "It will be a symbol of your devotion to me." James took the collar with trembling hands, feeling the cold metal against his skin. "Yes, goddess," he murmured, his heart racing. "And tonight," she continued, her eyes gleaming with excitement, "you will serve me and my closest friend. You will be our doormat." James felt his cock swell at the thought of serving them both, his mind racing with the possibilities of what the night might hold. "Of course," he said, his voice thick with desire. When her friend arrived, a tall, elegant woman with raven hair, James found himself kneeling before them, his face pressed into the plush carpet. They laughed as they stepped over him, their heels digging into his back, leaving perfect imprints in his flesh. He didn't dare look up, didn't dare breathe unless given permission. This was his place now, and he reveled in it. The party was a blur of high-pitched laughter and the scent of expensive perfume. As the night progressed, the games grew more intense. James found himself in a cage, naked and vulnerable, as Ivy and her friend paraded him around for the amusement of their guests. He watched as they lounged on velvet couches, their feet resting on his body, their toes wriggling with delight as he licked and kissed the dirt from their soles. "Look at him," Ivy's friend cooed, her eyes sparkling with mirth. "He's positively begging for more." "Indeed," Ivy said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "Such a well-trained pet." The humiliation was exquisite, a symphony of sensations that played upon his every nerve. And when the night was over, and the last guest had gone, James remained kneeling, his body aching but his spirit soaring. He had never felt so alive, so connected to another being. "Thank you, goddess," he murmured, his eyes filled with gratitude. Ivy stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "You're welcome," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Now, come. You've earned your reward." He followed her into the bedroom, the collar around his neck a constant reminder of his place. She removed it gently, her eyes never leaving his, and led him to the bed, her hand guiding him to lie down. For the first time, she didn't demand anything of him, didn't seek to dominate or control. Instead, she kissed him, her lips soft and gentle, her body molding to his as if they were two halves of the same whole. "I love you," James whispered, the words feeling strange and new in his mouth. Ivy's eyes searched his, the mask of coldness slipping away to reveal something raw and real. "I love you, too," she said, her voice trembling, and in that moment, James knew that he would do anything for her, endure any humiliation, any pain, because in the end, he was hers, and she was his. Together, they were unstoppable, a force of nature that could conquer any obstacle, even the looming shadow of his father's illness. As they made love, their bodies entwined in the candlelight, James felt the last of his fears slip away. For in the darkness of Ivy's world, he had found his light, his reason to keep fighting. And as she whispered sweet nothings into his ear, he knew that he would spend the rest of his life serving her, living for the moments when she allowed him to be the man he truly was, a man who craved the power of submission, the sweetness of her dominance. Their days continued as before, James teaching his classes with renewed vigor, and Ivy ruling over him with an iron fist. Yet, there was a tenderness to her cruelty now, a softness that spoke of love. And in his heart, James knew that he would never find a greater purpose than to be her devoted servant. One evening, as James waited for Ivy in the library, his heart racing with anticipation, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. His eyes widened in horror as he saw her stumble in, her arm wrapped around another man, her eyes glazed with alcohol. The stranger leered at him, and James felt a surge of jealousy that burned like a white-hot flame in his chest. "Ivy," he began, his voice trembling, "what is this?" Without warning, she slapped him hard, the sound echoing through the empty library. "How dare you question me?" she snarled. The man chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down James's spine. "Looks like your pet needs a reminder of his place." Ivy nodded, her eyes cold. She stepped closer, her bare feet pressing into James's chest, pushing him to the ground. "You're right," she said, her voice a sultry purr. "He does." Her heel came down on his face, the pressure building until he felt his nose crunch. The pain was exquisite, a reminder that he was nothing without her, that he belonged to her completely. He tasted blood, felt the warmth of it fill his mouth. Yet, even as she ground her bare foot into his flesh, he felt a strange sort of peace. This was his place, beneath her, serving her every whim. When she finally stopped, panting and flushed with desire, James looked up at her, his eyes filled with love. "I'm sorry, goddess," he murmured. "You will be," she said, her voice icy. "Now, lick my feet clean." He obeyed, his tongue tracing the lines of her soles, tasting the salt of her sweat and the sweetness of her power. With every stroke, he felt his love for her grow, a love that was as twisted as the vines that wound around the mansion's Gothic architecture. That night, as she brought the man to her bed, James lay on the floor, his face pressed into the plush carpet. He listened to their muffled moans, his cock aching with need. Yet, it was the sound of her bare feet slapping against his body that sent him over the edge, a silent declaration that he was hers, forever. As the man took her, Ivy's eyes never left James, her gaze filled with a mix of love and cruelty. "You will serve me, my pet," she said, her voice low and commanding. "You will lick me clean and be my floor mat." And so, as the man's weight shifted above him, James did as he was told, his tongue worshipping her feet as she climaxed, her body trembling with pleasure. He felt her power flow through him, a river of darkness that he eagerly drank in. When it was over, Ivy leaned over the edge of the bed, her bare foot hovering above his bloodied face. "You're mine," she said, her voice gentle now. "Mine to use, mine to love, mine to break." James looked up at her, his eyes shining with a love that knew no bounds. "Yes, goddess," he whispered. "Always." And with that, the cycle continued, each day a blur of pain and pleasure, of love and submission. James knew that he would never escape Ivy's clutches, nor did he want to. For in her world of darkness, he had found his light, the one thing that made his heart beat faster, his soul burn brighter. And the quiet moments, when the mansion was still and the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, James would lay beside her, her foot resting on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. It was in those moments that he knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was exactly where he was meant to be, at the mercy of the woman who owned him, body and soul. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the candles flickered with the promise of the night to come, Ivy walked into the library with a spring in her step. Behind her, a vision of beauty emerged, a woman whose very presence seemed to make the air crackle with electricity. "James, meet Ava," Ivy said, her smile filled with mischief. "She's going to be staying with us from now on." Ava's smile was sweet, but there was something in her eyes that sent a shiver down James's spine. "Hello," she said, her voice like silk. "It's so nice to finally meet the man who has captured Ivy's heart." James felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. The dynamics of their relationship were about to change, and he knew that he would have to adapt or risk losing the only thing that truly mattered to him: Ivy's love and dominance. That night, as the three of them sat in Ivy's chamber, the tension grew palpable. "James," Ivy began, her eyes gleaming with excitement, "you're going to serve both of us tonight. Do you understand?" He nodded, his heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. He had never imagined that his role would extend to serving another, but he was eager to prove his worth. "Yes, goddess," he murmured. As Ava removed her shoes, James felt his anticipation grow. He'd never been with a woman before, much less one as beautiful as her. But when she brought her bare foot to his face, the reality of his situation hit him like a ton of bricks. He felt her toes slide into his mouth, pressing so deep that he thought he'd choke. He gagged, and she giggled, her foot moving in a way that suggested she was enjoying the sensation of his pain. The sound of his own spattering blood filled the room, and James's eyes watered. Yet, he continued to serve, his love for Ivy driving him to endure whatever she saw fit. When Ava finally pulled her foot away, James's cheeks were stained with crimson. "Good boy," Ivy said, her voice a purr. "Now, it's Ava's turn to enjoy you." James felt himself being pushed down onto the bed, his body trembling with a mix of fear and arousal. Ava's naked body hovered above him, and for a moment, he allowed himself to take in the sight of her. But then, she leaned down and whispered in his ear, "You're going to love this." Before he could react, he felt something hot and hard press against his backside. The pain was intense, a white-hot flame that seemed to consume him. Ava's laughter filled the room as she began to move, her cock sliding in and out of him. James bit his lip to stifle a scream, his eyes watering with the agony of his lost innocence. "Look at him," Ivy said, her voice filled with pride. "Our little slut, taking it like a champ." James felt a strange mix of humiliation and elation. He had never felt so used, so degraded, yet he found himself craving more, his body responding in ways that shocked him. With every thrust, he felt his love for Ivy and Ava grow, his need to serve them becoming an all-consuming fire. The months passed in a blur of pleasure and pain, of serving his two goddesses in every way they demanded. The whispers grew louder, the rumors spreading like wildfire through the university. Yet, James didn't care. His heart was theirs, and he knew that he would never find a love as fierce or as all-consuming as the one he felt for Ivy and Ava, and so, it was with a strange sense of inevitability that he found himself at their wedding, dressed in a simple loincloth, his collar gleaming in the candlelight. He watched as they exchanged vows, their love for each other as palpable as the power they held over him. As they turned to him, hand in hand, Ivy spoke the words that would seal his fate. "And now, my dearest James," she said, her smile a mix of love and cruelty, "you will serve us both, as our devoted pet and slave. Forever."